Welcome to the islands of Hawaii, a tropical paradise loved for its natural beauty and relaxed lifestyle. But the history of these islands is far less tranquil. Aloha, I'm Kelly Hu, a native of these islands. The history of Hawaii is an epic tale of people trying to preserve an ancient way of life against invaders and against the odds. Our program explores Hawaii's long voyage from untouched wilderness to modern paradise. This is the story of the conquest of Hawaii.
If all of Hawaiian history can be crystallized into one moment, perhaps it was the night of January 16th, 1893, when the independent kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown with the help of the United States.
The legacy of the overthrow and annexation is a really bitter legacy. It is a dark page in American history, and few people know about it.
In Honolulu Harbor, pleasure boats trading ships in the USS Boston bobbed at their mooring. At the Hawaiian Hotel, a genteel crowd of Hawaiian society's upper crust enjoyed a band concert of popular music. Down the street in Iolani Palace, Queen Liliuokalani, the country's ruling monarch, distractedly picked out a tune on the piano. Downtown, a small group of Americans with names like Thurston, Castle, and Smith, the grandsons of Hawaii's missionary families, held a meeting. They called themselves the Committee of Safety, and their stated purpose was the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Supporting their efforts was no less than John L. Stevens, the U.S. Minister to Hawaii.
They put together this deal. Will you recognize us as the legitimate government? What a farce. Stevens tells them, sure, I can recognize you as the de facto government, the government in fact, but you have to have some kind of territory, so you got to take control of a building.
The Committee of Safety asked Stevens for support from U.S. military forces stationed in the islands. On the order from Stevens, 162 United States Marines from the USS Boston marched on Honolulu, armed with rifles, cannons, and Gatling guns.
If you hadn't known what was going on, you wouldn't have even understood that this was the end of Hawaii.
In less than 24 hours, U.S. troops had control of Iolani Palace. Sanford B. Dole informed the Queen that he was now president of the new provisional government of Hawaii. The next day, Queen Liliuokalani issued an official protest to the overthrow. I yield my authority, the Queen wrote, in order to avoid bloodshed and because I recognize the futility of a conflict with so formidable a power.
In ancient times, if you had warrior chiefesses, they would have said, we do go to battle, because it is the principle that we are fighting here. So we lose our lives, it doesn't matter. We fight for spiritual order. Well, by the time Liliuokalani, that was completely washed out of them. These were actually English people. These were Western people. Oh, they spoke the Hawaiian language, yes, but they did not live the Hawaiian way.
By avoiding bloodshed, 1,500 years of the Hawaiian way came to an end. A chain of kings and queens stretching back to the birth of the islands was broken. Hawaii was created in a crucible of tectonic fire in the midst of a vast, watery wilderness. As the molten rock cooled, a chain of 8 islands began to emerge about 5 million years ago. The islands would come to be known as Niihau, Kauai, Oahu, Molokai, Lanai, Maui, Kaho'olawe, and Hawaii. The islands remain to this day the most geographically remote place on Earth, farther from the nearest landmass than any other island chain. The first human settlers sailed north from the Marquesas Islands in southern Polynesia sometime around 300 AD. They traveled more than 2,000 miles in small canoes built with tools of shell and stone.
Our ancestors set out on purposeful voyages of discovery. They were discoverers, and they were settlers, and they were people completely at home in the sea.
In Hawaii, the Marquesans found a pristine and safe wilderness. There were no predatory animals, no poisonous snakes, no mosquitoes, no disease. It was a land they could mold and cultivate to their liking. The conquest of the islands had begun.
The islands themselves, really, in being so young geologically, did not have plant life or any animal life that would provide the carbohydrates or the proteins from the land that was required for human sustenance. So they had to virtually bring everything with them.
The first settlers introduced crops that are today synonymous with Hawaii, but were never native to the islands: the banana, coconut, sweet potato, and taro. These first Hawaiians also brought their religion, culture, and the practical skills to tame a wild land.
We think of just people, flotsam and jetsam, getting on the canoes and coming to the other islands. And we have to understand that only the very best of each discipline would come, because they would have to set up aquaculture, agriculture, the temples. So you would get the very best of each one to come and do this.
The new islanders perfected a simple agrarian society with two classes: the commoners and the high chiefs. Ruling families shared the islands equally. This system worked remarkably well for nearly 1,000 years. During that time, there were no wars, no conflict, and for reasons not completely understood, the Hawaiians lived in perfect isolation. No one came and stayed, and no one left, until sometime between the 11th and 14th centuries. Then canoes bearing hundreds of Tahitians began arriving, and eventually the settlers came under the control of a Tahitian priest named Pa'ao.
Pa'ao has always been given credit for creating a new awareness on the island of Hawaii, a new idea of priesthood, a new idea of recognizing certain principles, and it was going to be a change for everyone living here on the island of Hawaii.
Pa'ao introduced a new culture, but more importantly, a new system of laws, and a religion that worshipped the god Ku, the god of war.
A wave that some have called an invasion of Hawaii from Tahiti. We also brought in an ali'i or chiefly system, which was far more stratified than that which the earlier settlers had experienced.
No longer would the ruling class share power equally, because Pa'ao championed the idea of mana, a spiritual energy that could be accumulated through acts of bravery, ritualized sacrifice, and war.
Mana is the spiritual equivalent of blood. It's present in all things, and it represents the life force of anything. But we've always realized that mana can be more concentrated and more powerful in certain individuals over others. A chief with great mana is a chief who is difficult to defeat in battle, but also a chief who's attractive, virile, strong, intelligent.
The more you put into it, the more you got back. It was almost like a banking account.
The more mana accumulated, the more power a chief had. Mana changed Hawaiian society radically and fundamentally.
You had many more fights amongst the chiefs after that introduction. And warfare then became necessary to settle disputes.
By the middle of the 18th century, the idyllic system of equal plots of land was ancient history. Each island was now controlled by some half-dozen chiefs who used their mana to claim more land and more power. But some of these chiefs were still not satisfied. They wanted even greater power. And this would usher in the bloodiest period in Hawaiian history.
Coming up next, island warfare Hawaiian style. Chief against chief, till death do one of them part. Conquest of Hawaii will continue in a moment.
By the 18th century, warring chiefs competing for more mana, more power, set off one of the bloodiest periods in Hawaiian history.
That last 100 years was just filled with one battle after another. Chiefs just trying to jostle for position.
Lua, the Hawaiian art of war, was mastered by the ruling chiefs who were imposing figures on the battlefield.
It was customary for them to pluck all the hair from their body, rub themselves with oil, so that nobody could hold on to them. And this is the way they went into battle. And they often ate a berry that made them have reddish look to the eyes. So there'd be this guy that was awesome looking in battle, no hair, no eyebrows, red eyes, you know, big and just breaking arms and legs wherever he went.
The Hawaiians had to be inventive in their weaponry. Without the knowledge of how to forge metal, they fashioned deadly spears and clubs out of wood that would be tipped with shark teeth. Among the warriors' favorite weapons was the ikoi, a weighted stone on the end of an 18-foot cord. Each warrior made his own weapons.
Sometimes he made a cord that connected the ball to his hand from the intestines of the enemy. They would dry it, make it like leather, weave it, and use that because that was mana, you know, made from a fallen enemy.
By the late 1770s, about a dozen chiefs had risen to the level of mo'i, supreme chief. Kauai and Niihau had its own mo'i. Maui, Lanai, and Kaho'olawe were ruled by another. Oahu and Molokai were linked under the control of yet another supreme chief. The big island of Hawaii was carved into large districts controlled by 3 to 6 warring mo'i. This was Hawaii at the time the first Westerners arrived on its shores. This was the Hawaii British adventurer Captain James Cook discovered.
Cook was the first man to come all the way up from the bottom of the barrel as just an able seaman and work his way all the way up through the ranks and become an officer commanding a ship. That had never previously happened in the history of the Royal Navy.
Captain Cook was an insatiable explorer. He charted the St. Lawrence River, claimed the eastern shore of New Holland, later called Australia for Britain, explored the Arctic Circle, and sailed long, sweeping arcs through the South Pacific.
He was filling in all the blank spaces on the map, and it was a ceaseless voyage. I mean, he just never seemed to tire of it. He was effectively king of the Pacific Ocean. Nobody could touch him.
Between voyages, Cook was the toast of the town in London.
He's a rock star. He's the man in England, and he's meeting royalty. He's dining with the intellectual greats. Everyone wants a piece of Cook.
In 1776, the Earl of Sandwich financed Cook's expedition through the Pacific and then on northward to search for a Northwest Passage, a saleable route from the Pacific to the Atlantic. Cook assembled a ragtag group of men to crew his 2 ships, the Resolution and Discovery. The crew spent a year in the South Pacific before charting a course northward. When they left the Society Islands in December 1777, Cook was sure his next landfall was many, many months away.
He found almost everything. There was no need to think that there was really anything north of the equator that was in comparison with what lay south of the equator.
But at dawn on January 18th, 1778, Cook and his crew were stunned by what they discovered. Cook had come upon an island, Kauai, on the horizon. Europeans had arrived in Hawaii and nothing would ever be the same. They set anchor in deep water off the shore from the small village of Waimea. The villagers, who had watched the approaching ships from the hills above Waimea, paddled out to greet the Resolution, cautiously at first.
Cook and his men couldn't get over how much food was given to them, not traded, but given to them every single day that they were here. It stemmed from an amazing abundance. That's what they're seeing. Hawaii at its most vibrant.
They would be the first and last Westerners to see this Hawaii.
It cannot be emphasized enough that the first contact with Westerners would have a devastating effect upon the population.
Cook knew the Hawaiians had no resistance to the diseases his men carried, like syphilis, gonorrhea, and measles. So Cook quarantined his sailors on their ships and sent only his most trusted men ashore. But it was not enough.
He sent his his lieutenant Phillips ashore with a watering party, and he instructed his lieutenant to be sure that the men didn't have any sex with the women. When Phillips returned, he told Cook that he'd been unable to comply with the order. And Cook seems to have sort of accepted the notion that the islands were now doomed.
Doomed by disease and violence. Within days of his arrival, a party of Kauai men surrounded skiffs from the Resolution and Discovery and began pulling at oars, muskets, anything not nailed down. One native grabbed a boat hook, and when he wouldn't let go, he was shot. He was the first native Hawaiian to die by gunfire.
Hawaiian history is marked by many dramatic, significant moments that literally turn history around. Cook's visit brought a sense of Western knowledge to the islands and a knowledge of Hawaii to the West, which would again have a devastating impact on the Kanaka Maolis, or the native people's control of the islands.
Cook named Hawaii the Sandwich Islands in honor of his patron. But Cook's mission wasn't to colonize, it was to discover. A few days after he arrived, he left Kauai to continue northward. Cook spent nearly a year unsuccessfully searching for a northwest passage. Eventually, the ice-packed waters and the need to resupply forced Cook back to the Sandwich Islands. On January 17th, 1779, Cook sailed into Kealakekua Bay on the island of Hawaii.
As he sailed into that bay, as beautiful as it must have been, what was even probably more overwhelming were the 15,000 Hawaiians who came to greet him in their canoes, lavishing them with gifts and praise, bringing him to the shore, feasting with him and his men, and honoring him as a great chief.
The Hawaiians had never developed a written language, but they had a highly evolved culture of chant and dance. They presented Cook and his men with their history. The hula and chants were epic stories of the Hawaiian gods and goddesses, warriors, and the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Cook was overwhelmed by their hospitality and culture. He was even the first Westerner to witness board surfing, something Cook had described as the most supreme pleasure, to be driven so fast and smoothly by the sea. But it was not just the freedom and spirit of the Hawaiians that he wrote about. Cook also noted in his diaries that the health of the native Hawaiians was already in jeopardy.
The island of Hawaii, now that was to the far south of Kauai, but he saw evidence of the venereal disease that his men had left on Kauai. It had spread that rapidly. It was a very unfortunate harbinger of what Western influence would bring to the Hawaiian people.
In early February 1779, Captain Cook and his crew left Hawaii to return to the Pacific Northwest in search of a northwest passage. Hit by a storm, the mast of the Resolution snapped. They returned to Hawaii. This time they weren't met by throngs of warmly welcoming Hawaiians.
They were tired of it. You know, the guest who had stayed too long. So there was a little bit of irritation, and the irritation led to confrontations between some Hawaiians and some of Cook's officers.
The Hawaiians began to harass Cook's ships and crew. First by stealing small items off the ships, and then by taking one of the skiffs from the Discovery. To get it back, Cook took an action that had worked before.
Now, during one of his earlier visits in Tahiti, he had learned that, well, if you hold a chief hostage, you can get pretty much what you want during a crisis situation. He wanted that boat back, and his plan was to take Kalaniʻōpuʻu, this great chief, hostage. I don't believe he ever intended to hurt Kalaniʻōpuʻu, but he did believe that this would work.
Captain Cook had respect for the integrity of the islanders. In his words, no people could trade with more honesty. But he would make a decision that would prove fatal. Conquest of Hawaii will return. Hawaii is a land of extremes. Mount Waialeale on Kauai is the wettest spot on Earth, with an average annual rainfall of 40 feet. Kilauea is the world's most active volcano. Molokai has the world's highest sea cliffs. Hawaii's history is also filled with extremes: serenity and violence, prosperity and poverty. You are watching Conquest of Hawaii.
On February 14, 1779, Captain James Cook attempted to take High Chief Kalaniʻōpuʻu hostage in retaliation for the theft by Hawaiians of one of his skiffs. Hostage-taking had worked before and was largely symbolic, but this time, Cook's strategy would prove fatal.
Kalaniʻōpuʻu was prepared to go with them until Kalaniʻōpuʻu's women began to cry and chant a sort of a death chant. When he tried to pull away, Cook put his hands on the chief. And when he did that, it got the warriors all upset.
One of the local men starts prodding at Cook with a spear in the back and in the thighs. And Cook turns around and fires his gun at this man. And that becomes a cue almost to just lay into Cook. Cook is stabbed, he falls. The local people set upon him and they beat him with their fists. They take knives, the very knives that Cook and his men had brought to the island, and they're plunging it into his body.
Cook crawled toward his skiff, but the boat was already rowing away with a few surviving crew members. He couldn't chase after it because Cook, the explorer who had sailed and charted a quarter of the world's oceans, didn't know how to swim.
Cook is defenseless. So just in a matter of minutes, Cook and a few of his men are dead. And Cook's body stays there at the waterline as men, women, and children continue to just tear at him with knives.
Cook's body was now in the hands of the Hawaiians.
Cook's remains were prepared in virtually the same way that a Hawaiian who might have died at that period of time would have been prepared.
The body was cut into pieces. Some parts were preserved, like the hands and the head. The rest was cooked in an underground oven so the flesh could be stripped away from the bone. This common practice led some British to believe that the Hawaiians were cannibals. They weren't. What they wanted from the bones was Cook's mana, his spiritual energy, his power. By the time his men came ashore to reclaim Cook's body, it was too late.
His hands have been cut off and stuffed with salt to be preserved, and so a hand is given back. They give back parts of Cook's head. They give some parts of his uniform. Cook's remains are placed in a casket. It's weighted with cannonballs. The burial service is read and it's dumped over the side. And Cook's body, the remains of it, are still down there somewhere.
Captain Cook left much more than his earthly remains on the shores of Kealakekua Bay. He left Western knowledge of technology, weaponry, and military tactics. Knowledge that had been voraciously absorbed by one young Hawaiian named Kamehameha. He would soon conquer all of Hawaii. It was said that Kamehameha, the nephew of Kalaniʻōpuʻu, was destined for greatness from the moment of his birth. According to legend, on the day he was born, a new star appeared in the heavens. A legend that the young prince's birthday did coincide with the real-life appearance of Halley's Comet in 1758. Kamehameha was not only strong, he was also extraordinarily intelligent and had the mind of a scientist. He was among the first Hawaiians at Kealakekua Bay to board James Cook's ship and pump Cook for information through a Tahitian interpreter.
Cook notes that he has met a young chief by the name of Kamehameha. That this Kamehameha is a very fierce-looking man, a very quiet man, a very brooding man, and his interest is Cook's guns.
All of a sudden now, there are muskets and there are, more importantly, cannons that allow you to engage from further and further away and inflict, in a more devastating way, a greater toll on the loss of life. I think he realizes that any elite who has the benefit of that technology will have the advantage.
It seems that Kamehameha also saw the future of Hawaii aboard the great English ship.
I think he sees that there's no reason to believe that if this man got here, that he's the last person that's going to get here. And that he needs to do things to consolidate power to be able to, if need be in the future, fend off this sort of incursion again.
Kamehameha's contact with Cook also coincided with a time of great upheaval in the history of Hawaii.
the islands had fallen into great warfare. And so here you had the islands poised for a great battle to see which of the chiefs would be able to bring all these islands together.
In 1782, the political atmosphere in the islands became even more volatile. The great Hawaiian chief Kalaniʻōpuʻu died. For Kamehameha, the chief's death was an opportunity to begin his conquest of the islands.
Kamehameha was a very unusual warrior chief because during his first battles when he was trying to conquer the island of Hawaii, he lost most of them. But after each engagement, he'd retrain his warriors, make them better fighters.
Kamehameha embraced the technology and strategies of the West and soon had control of the big island of Hawaii.
He was very smart. Kamehameha learned from everybody. He didn't fear foreigners. When you look at his career, you see somebody who was fiercely intelligent, but also able to change, able to learn from new experiences.
The foreigners came for highly prized and fragrant sandalwood that was exported mostly to Asia for use in perfumes and aromatic oils. The foreigners were willing to trade arms for access to the forest. First to arrive were British ships. Then in 1790, the first Americans came to Hawaii aboard the sister ships, Fair American and the Eleanora. It was an inauspicious beginning. After a native Hawaiian killed one of the Eleanora's crew, the captain of the Eleanora, Simon Metcalf, retaliated by ordering a wholesale slaughter known as the Oluwalu Massacre.
Metcalf did a horrible thing. He transferred all of his cannon to the starboard side of his ship, and he called out the people of Oluwalu to come and trade him. He let them know that they should all bring their canoes to the starboard side of the ship, and when they sort of gathered there in mass, he opened fire on men, women, and children.
The Hawaiian people were slaughtered. One of the men on that ship who had witnessed this slaughter, a Britisher by the name of John Young, had been on shore, and Kamehameha, I wouldn't say kidnapped him, but brought him a deal, and that deal was, you stay with me, and I'll protect you, and I would take care of you.
Kamehameha's warriors took control of the Eleanora's sister ship, the Fair American, and slaughtered its crew. Only one man, Isaac Davis, survived. Now Kamehameha had two Western sailors, Davis and Young. Kamehameha offered them a deal: serve him or die.
These two men, John Young and Isaac Davis, became close associates of Kamehameha and served as his military and political advisors during the unification of the islands.
Young and Davis taught Kamehameha Western military tactics, helped negotiate arms deals with visiting ships, and opened Kamehameha's eyes to his potential power. Kamehameha became the West's greatest trading partner and even adopted their style of dress.
Kamehameha was so enamored of the English, so enamored of King George, the silk stockings, the knickers, the little vest, the silk shirt. And he wanted Hawaii to be part and parcel of Great Britain. That was his love.
He struck a deal with the foreigners then. Food for firepower, sandalwood for firepower. And he built quite a sizable navy based on a combination of British shipbuilding with a Hawaiian flair. The Napoleon of the Pacific, they call him.
In 1794, armed with British and American weapons, ships, foreign advisors, and an enormous and tremendously loyal army, Kamehameha began his inexorable march to control more than just the big island of Hawaii. First, he took Maui and its allied islands. Then in 1795, Kamehameha's forces set their sights on Hawaii's second most populous island. Oahu fell at the Battle of Nu'uanupali, at the cliffs of Nu'uanu.
His war canoes are said to have stretched miles and miles and miles down the beach, and you can imagine that was an incredible and impressive sight. These warriors came ashore and systematically worked the Oahu warriors back toward a central valley called Nu'uanu Valley, just above the harbor of Honolulu. Cannons were taken off the ships and were hauled up the valley. That's not a very simple feat, but they brought the cannon to the battlefield, and that made by far the difference, as they were able to keep walking them back further and further into the valley till they had nowhere to go.
Kamehameha's armies forced their enemies into the mountains and to the edge of a cliff. Warriors and women and children and the elderly who didn't want to be separated from their families were pushed off the cliff by Kamehameha's advancing forces. Thousands of people died, the exact number is unknown, but it was reported to be the single greatest loss of life of any battle in Hawaiian history. Kamehameha now had only Kauai and its sister island Ni'ihau left to conquer. If he accomplished this, a new nation, a unified Hawaii, would be born.
When we return, an end to the ancient Hawaiian religion.
In the first years of the 19th century, Kamehameha accomplished what no other chief before him could or would accomplish. He controlled all of the Hawaiian Islands except for Kauai and Ni'ihau.
We're talking about total decimation and destruction. So unification is a kindly term that's used after the fact. It's actually conquering the chain, and that's exactly what he did.
Unification was at hand if only Kamehameha could conquer the high chief of Kauai, Kaumuali'i. Kamehameha's first attempt was thwarted by storms. Then in 1804, a plague decimated his fighting force. Kamehameha realized that he might not ever get the chance to defeat Kaumuali'i on the battlefield. So Kamehameha decided to take Kauai with diplomacy.
And that agreement would be that Kaumuali'i would come under the reign of Kamehameha, now having unified the islands as a Hawaiian nation, as a Hawaiian kingdom, and that he would retain virtual control of his own island. And it was that final act which created the Hawaiian nation in 1810.
1810, the first year in Hawaiian history when all the islands were ruled by a single leader, a king, Kamehameha. And among the king's first acts was a peace proposal.
After unification, he declares that warfare shall not exist in his kingdom. And it is from that point forward that actually Hawaii will not experience the warfare that has marked so many of its centuries.
You have to heal the wounds. You've destroyed so many chiefs. You destroyed so many families who supported these other chiefs. So now you have to take the time to caring for them to show that you are sincere in rebuilding.
Kamehameha soon faced a threat from an outsider. In 1815, a German adventurer by the name of George Anton Schaefer arrived as the foreman of a Russian-American sandalwood operation. Schaefer hatched a plan with Kauai's chief to retake the Hawaiian Islands with Russian arms and ships.
Kamehameha sent a small group of warriors, and the message was real simple. Pack up, and leave, or you'll never leave here alive.
The Russians left. Hawaii's first brush with foreign conquest impelled Kamehameha to create a flag of his own, the first flag of the nation of Hawaii.
So if you look at the flag, you'll see a little of France, you'll see a little of America, and you'll see a little Britain, all placed together, which symbolically represented the idea that Kamehameha is sending a signal to all three of these great nations in the Pacific that we are friends with all three of you, which means that each of you have a responsibility to recognize my independence.
Throughout his reign, Kamehameha adopted Western ways, but he never abandoned native culture, particularly the culture's emphasis on kapu, prohibitions similar to the word tabu.
Kamehameha, of course, accepted Western ways in many manners. However, when it came to religious and spiritual matters, Kamehameha respected the kapu, maintained the kapu, and promoted that aspect of his culture and society.
Kapu that governed behavior in the presence of the king were the strictest. Commoners could not touch the clothing or any personal articles of the king. They had to stoop or crawl in his presence and could not look directly at him. There were also kapu governing every aspect of daily life. Who can fish and when? What can be planted and how? Where people may eat, sleep, and worship.
Kapu means to make sacred. That's really what it means. It doesn't mean just to prohibit. It means that something is sacred and therefore it's not necessarily for you.
One of the most strictly enforced was the aikapu, the prohibition on men and women eating together. Punishment for breaking the aikapu was severe.
If a man and woman were discovered eating together, they died. Both of them. They died. It was really simple.
The kapu system was the bedrock of native Hawaiian life until 1819, the year that King Kamehameha, now in his early 60s, suddenly got very sick. While traditional healers tried to save his life, the king was comforted by Ka'ahumanu, the favorite of his more than 20 wives. Not only was Ka'ahumanu beautiful, she was also a daughter, sister, and cousin of Hawaii's greatest warriors and a skillful politician in her own right. Kamehameha had decreed a kapu on Ka'ahumanu's body, meaning no one but the king could touch her.
Many songs and chants have been written about this in a very romantic way, that he put a kapu on her body because of his great love for her. Actually put a kapu on her body because he didn't want any other chief to get any ideas to take this great power away from him. If he lost these great generals, he would lose the islands.
On his deathbed, Kamehameha followed the British monarchy's lead and named his eldest son Liholiho as his heir apparent. Though she wasn't Liholiho's mother, he named Ka'ahumanu as the new king's chief counselor, the first woman in Hawaiian history to hold such an influential position. This was Kamehameha's final act. King Kamehameha died at his home in Kailua on May 8, 1819. It may have been typhus, cholera, or any number of diseases that were sweeping the islands. But there were also rumors that he had been poisoned by Ka'ahumanu. Under this cloud of suspicion, the great king was prepared for his funeral rites. It is said that the wails of his people could be heard from ships anchored a mile offshore.
The great chief had died, and all of Hawaii was to undergo tremendous change as the question came, who would rule in his place?
Ka'ahumanu had her own answer.
She summoned Liholiho and said, oh, Chief, there are your lands. Those are your chiefs. Here are your guns. But you and I will rule together. And that's not what she meant. She meant I will rule. And if you're smart, you'll stay out of my way.
So she took his place in council. She donned the cape. She was, for all intent and purposes, the sole ruler of the island. Liholiho was the puppet king.
But Ka'ahumanu had a problem. According to traditional law, when a chief died, his lands were redistributed among a number of high chiefs. But neither Ka'ahumanu nor Liholiho wanted to lose any part of the islands they now controlled.
They said, why should we give up what we earned through battle? So in order not to do this, you had to completely destroy the foundation upon which everything was built. And that's exactly what they did.
Ka'ahumanu destroyed the foundation of Hawaiian law by breaking its most secret kapu, the prohibition against men and women eating together. The embers in King Kamehameha's funeral oven were barely cool when Ka'ahumanu commanded Liholiho to a feast.
She just beckoned him, and he came. And that was it. He came and sat with her and took a morsel of food from her hand. So that was just that one occasion, forever etched in history. You're talking about 2,000 years of law. This is a long time to adhere to a set of rules. And then all of a sudden, overnight, someone says, you know, now we can eat together. Now we can live together. Now there is no kapu.
Ka'ahumanu then ordered all the religious images burned and the temples destroyed.
So you can imagine if everybody went into all the churches in your neighborhood, broke up the churches, broke up the images, knocked down all the crosses, you know, and said God no longer exists. This is exactly what happened to the Hawaiians.
But there was resistance. The new king's cousin, Kekuaokalani, raised an army in revolt against the end of Kapu. Fighting by Kekuaokalani's side was his wife, Manono.
The wives would join their husbands in a last-ditch effort to fight. Because if they didn't do that, they became spoils for the new king. So if a woman loved her husband, he'd rather die with him in battle than to be a slave or married to somebody that she didn't love.
The king's forces and the rebels met at the Battle of Kuamo'o. The rebels were no match for the king's army outfitted with Western firearms. Kekuaokalani was shot dead by Liholiho's forces, who then turned on his wife, Manono, and shot her in the head. The ancient religion went out in a blaze of musket fire.
After they killed Kekuaokalani, they decimated everyone in his entourage.
Well, the bodies are left there, covered in stone. And today, if you go to Kuamo'o, you can walk there right through a little rocky trail that leads through these piles of stones that are all about you. Each of them contain the defenders of the ancient ways.
By destroying the old religion and quashing any rebellion, Hawaii now had a single royal family determined by hereditary birthright. Liholiho, who called himself King Kamehameha II, was nominally in charge, but the real power was with his father's favorite wife, Queen Ka'ahumanu, who had instigated a revolution by destroying the old ways.
Next, it would be an invasion without muskets and gunpowder. Hawaii is transformed by Bibles, sermons, and men of God. We'll be back with more of Conquest of Hawaii. Aloha, I'm Kelly Hu. I grew up in Honolulu and attended the Kamehameha schools, one of many places named in honor of our greatest king. Kamehameha I died in 1819. The same year, a ship left Boston filled with missionaries. Their goal was to convert the pagan islanders into Christians. The religious conquest of Hawaii was about to begin.
The original pioneer missionaries left New England without any knowledge of the death of Kamehameha, which had actually happened in May of 1819. Absolutely no foreknowledge of any of the events that were going on while they were at sea. This included the overthrow of the Kapu system. The ancient religious system had been overthrown. Wars had resulted in the defenders of the old system fighting against the forces of the new Kamehameha II government, which was enforcing this overthrow of the Kapu.
The missionary party was led by Reverend Hiram Bingham and Asa Thurston. They had convinced the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions to fund an expedition after they had heard a young Hawaiian named Henry Obukaya give a speech at Yale College.
Henry Obukaya actually grew up at Kealakekua, in the place where Captain Cook had met his end. He had escaped from the wars of Kamehameha with his own brother dying during those conflicts. And then he got onto a ship and went off to America, where he was adopted by a Christian family. And the story is told that he sat on the steps of Yale Library weeping. And one of the teachers saw him and asked what was wrong. And he said, "There's so much knowledge in this building and so little knowledge in my head." He became a wonderful convert for the Congregational Church, who used him as the poster boy for mission effort.
Obukaya had planned to travel with the missionaries back to Hawaii, but he died before the Thaddeus set sail. 4 other native Hawaiians were on board to act as guides and interpreters. On March 30th, 1820, the Thaddeus sailed quietly into a harbor on the big island of Hawaii.
When they arrived at Kawaihae on the island of Hawaii, the first question that Hiram Bingham asked was, "What's the news? What's going on?" And the answer was, "Kamehameha's dead. The islands are in chaos. There's no religion." Well, the impact of that statement upon these young missionaries was overwhelming. Hiram Bingham gathered up his brothers and sisters in Christ. They knelt on the main deck of the Thaddeus, and they praised the Lord for having come here to overthrow the Kapu for them.
When the missionaries were granted an audience with Queen Ka'ahumanu, there was a strange kind of meeting of the minds. Ka'ahumanu had something the missionaries wanted, non-Christian heathens. And the missionaries had something Ka'ahumanu wanted.
With the abrogation of the Kapu, you had to replace it with something. You've just thrown away the baby with the bathwater. What is going to replace that order? Ah, this replaces that order. How wonderful. Something completely new. Something that allows me to be boss forever. Something that doesn't challenge my role. And that's exactly what happened.
Conversion didn't happen overnight. Hiram Bingham built Hawaii's first Christian church, but few native Hawaiians came. They were suspicious of the foreigners, who they referred to as haulis.
They couldn't get people to come out to their church except to listen to them sing. And they would lament that there wasn't a general acceptance. And it wasn't really until the conversion of the chiefs that you saw a change in the population.
In 1824, measles claimed the life of King Kamehameha II. The king's younger brother, 12-year-old Kamehameha III, ascended the throne, but Ka'ahumanu remained firmly in control. She also publicly converted to Christianity.
The people had by that time no say at all, because the foundation on which their kapus sat was destroyed. So it no longer came from the Council of Chiefs. It no longer came from the Council of Priests. It no longer came from the Halinawa. It was their house of law. It just came from that one person.
A year later, in 1825, Ka'ahumanu developed a serious illness and she became an even more passionate Christian convert.
It looks like she's going to die. Bingham comes over, prays over her bed day and night. She recovers. She does perceive that this religion may have the same kinds of healing power that the old religions were believed to have. You know? After all, you know, haole, they get sick of these diseases, but they don't die.
With still no resistance to the diseases brought by foreigners, native Hawaiians were rapidly dying off.
If our demographers are correct, 80% of the population must have perished just between the years that Cook arrived and Kamehameha died. It had to have been absolutely horrible.
They used it against Hawaiians at the time and said, see, your system was wrong. Your system resulted in the deaths that you've been seeing around you. Now, honor God.
The native Hawaiians came to church because they were told to, but they stayed because of what they found in the back of the pews, a written language.
The reading and the writing. That itself was a new power, a new technology that not only, I think, impressed the chiefs in their dealings with foreigners, but I think swept like wildfire among the people.
Bingham worked closely with a bilingual Hawaiian named John Papa'i'i to create a written Hawaiian language. As standardized by the missionaries, Hawaiian has 7 consonants and 5 vowels, 12 letters that blend to create the sounds and pronunciations of this unique language. To spread the written word, primers were distributed free to those who would attend church. By 1831, most Hawaiians could read and write. At the time, Hawaii reached the highest literacy rate of any country in the world.
Many missionaries give accounts of going to a village and being told that we want palapala, reading and writing, because it makes us feel close to God. That when they read the words, their mind fills with the spirit of Akua, of God.
Queen Ka'ahumanu wrote new laws based on the 10 Commandments. And she heeded the demands of the missionaries that the traditional Hawaiian way of life be abolished.
To the missionaries who knew nothing but what they had known back home, the Hawaiians were these terrible barbarians needing great change.
What they saw was degradation. But I think they also saw the unsanitariness of things, the unhealthiness of the population. And it became really clear that you not just convert the people to this new religion, but that all kinds of changes had to be made in their lives in order to make them civilized.
Religious rituals, chants, and the hula, all forms of expressing and passing on the history of the Hawaiian people, were outlawed.
The hula was such a disturbing kind of dance to these missionaries because it celebrated in a kind of eroticness that was inherent in Hawaiian culture. It also celebrated gods, of course, that as far as they were concerned did not exist.
My husband's family were forbidden to teach hula, forbidden to teach esoteric lore, forbidden to heal on pain of incarceration and fine, chain gangs. A people conquered.
All of these occupations were null and void now. They were gone. So what do we use? What do we stand on? We have nothing at this point, except the Word of God.
The missionaries set up free schools to educate the island's children.
The missionaries were allowed to take over all of the children who had the potential of becoming a future king and queen and sequestering them in a school absolutely removed from their earlier life. The thought that for their own good, they would have to be westernized quickly and totally.
But mission schools had at least one unintended effect. Young scholars in Maui used their new literacy to document Hawaiian history by talking to their elders, who still remembered the traditional ways.
They wrote down rituals, they wrote down social class systems, they recorded the history of the ruling chiefs and of the common people. And that legacy, I think, is just invaluable.
One of those students was David Malo, who would become one of Hawaii's greatest intellectuals. Malo had a prophetic sense about the ultimate conquest of Hawaii when he wrote, "The white man's ships have arrived with clever men from the big countries. They know our people are few in number, and our country is small. They will devour us." By 1832, Hawaii was being inundated by foreigners. 5 shiploads of Protestant missionaries had landed to settle all of the Hawaiian Islands. On Oahu, Queen Ka'ahumanu was nearly 70. She retired to her country house, confident in the ability of Kamehameha III to carry out her wishes. On June 5, 1832, Queen Ka'ahumanu, the woman who had started a revolution by abandoning the ways of her ancestors and embracing a new religion, died. She is said to have passed while whispering the words, "Here I am, O Jesus, grant me thy gracious smile." For all intents and purposes, Hawaii was now a Christian nation, and its future would be shaped by those who brought the religion to the islands.
The missionaries may have come here to do good. They stayed here to do well. There were millions to be made in sugar, pineapple, and other products. Hawaii's version of a gold rush, when conquest of Hawaii continues.
In the decade following Queen Ka'ahumanu's death in 1832, David Malo's prophecy that Hawaiians would be eaten up by foreigners was coming true. Trade expanded rapidly, and Honolulu began to look less like a native village and more like an American or British town. The weapons that had won the islands for King Kamehameha I were now rusted and obsolete, having been traded for the power of the Bible and laws based on the Ten Commandments. As foreigners settled, they began to make more political demands on the monarchy. In 1839, France used gunboat diplomacy to urge King Kamehameha III to accept French wine and brandy with minimal duty, and to re-establish the Catholic Church, which had been thrown out of the islands in 1837.
Kamehameha III is forced to sign this treaty because the Hawaiian kingdom has no military power. Kamehameha III has to consider a different solution, and at this point, there are people who are there to advise him that what is needed is a more civilized system of lawmaking and rule.
Those advisors included William Richards, the first missionary to join Kamehameha's government. In 1840, Richards encouraged the king to create Hawaii's first written constitution.
The advice that he got from missionaries was, if you honor foreign institutions, law, if you have a civilized country, if you have constitutional governments, they're going to honor you for that. They're not going to come and take away your kingdom.
That advice was tested in 1843 when George Paulet of England seized the Hawaiian Islands and raised the English flag. Within months, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Naval Forces in the Pacific intervened and restored the sovereignty of Kamehameha III. Shortly thereafter, both Britain and France jointly agreed to consider Hawaii an independent nation. The American government watched the British incident very closely because in 1843, the United States declared that it would never permit another world power to violate Hawaiian sovereignty. But the United States may have had a change of heart when in 1845, Hawaii's best natural harbor caught the eye of a contingent of U.S. Marines that anchored off Honolulu. The Hawaiians called the area Pearl Harbor because it had once been known for its abundance of oysters. The Marines instantly saw Pearl Harbor as the perfect location to build forts.
The American expedition was ostensibly a scientific expedition, although it brought back a lot of information about Pearl Harbor and some other strategic military information that would be useful.
With Britain and France gone and the United States supposedly steering clear of any claims on Hawaii, the islands were prosperous and at peace. King Kamehameha III's constitution seemed to be working. The king filled all of his cabinet positions with foreign-born ministers, mostly Americans. Several cabinet members were also missionaries.
There was a concerted effort to maintain the integrity of the culture with Kamehameha III, but the Christian hold was too powerful.
Not everyone was pleased with the growing influence of missionaries and foreigners. The king received petitions of protest, signed by thousands of native Hawaiians.
The petitions asked the king not to make chiefs out of foreigners. The petitions also said, please do not sell any land to foreigners.
But on the advice of his foreign-born ministers, Kamehameha III did both. In 1845, foreigners were allowed to become naturalized citizens.
The kingdom begins accepting oaths of allegiance from these foreigners under the hopes that, if you treat them like chiefs, then they will behave like chiefs, which of course is a terribly vain hope.
And when they became subjects, the Haoles, the non-Hawaiians, wanted the same rights they had had in their countries of origin, especially legal title to land.
Ownership. The very word itself is foreign, really. There is no word for owning land in Hawaii. So how do you go about selling land when it belongs to virtually everyone?
The government's answer was the Great Mahele of 1848, a proposal that divided Hawaiian land. Most went to the king, the chiefs, and the government. Only a small fraction went to the common people.
There was also that aspect of the Mahele which believed that if you gave title to the lands, then the people would build up this yeoman farmer class. The irony, of course, was that the common people got 1% of that land.
The Mahele, what a tragedy. In applying Western land law to a very non-Western society, it absolutely changes everything very quickly.
The Mahele also allowed foreigners to purchase Hawaiian land. In some cases, the land was being bought at rock-bottom prices by missionaries and their descendants.
The great significance of this period is that the vast majority of Hawaiian people become landless after 1850.
This was devastating, since Hawaiians believe in a deep-rooted spiritual connection to the land, called aloha aina, literally, love of the land.
The tragedy is that Kamehameha III, who so wants to do good, he has no motive except to save his people. He does this, and he immediately realizes that he has made a terrible mistake. And it breaks his heart. And he lives, another 6 years and dies a broken man.
For the missionary families, however, it was the beginning of a new era of prosperity. Ironically, the opportunity was created when the American Board of Foreign Missions cut off all funding by 1845. Soon after, they declared the Hawaiian mission successful and ordered the missionaries home.
The missionaries had a choice. Did they want to go home, or did they want to stay in Hawaii and somehow support themselves?
The missionary families who stayed behind went into business. They started sugar and pineapple plantations and made fortunes in land development. Their names, Castle, Cook, Dole, and Spreckles, still grace the products and properties of modern Hawaii.
Their wealth had been built up because of the tremendous market in America that had taken place during the Civil War. Because much of America's sugar was produced in the South, and of course the North was blockading the South from trade. The United States bought virtually every ounce of sugar produced within the Hawaiian Kingdom in this period.
With wealth came a desire for more political control. The new land barons pressed for an increasing role in the government. A succession of short-lived kings led many American business owners to conclude that the monarchy was unstable.
At the death of every king, the annexationist element here brings up the idea that, well, maybe now is the time that we join a stronger and safer nation. You have this beautiful place with the population that's growing smaller and smaller and smaller, and what a waste. And the American community is growing larger, it's healthier. You begin to see the American community thinking, well, maybe this is fate.
Not wanting to leave it to chance, powerful American business interests in Hawaii were looking for more power and more control. Before the end of the 19th century, they would take what they wanted.
When conquest of Hawaii continues, the American government takes a part of Hawaii that was then obscure, but would later live in infamy, Pearl Harbor. We'll be right back.
In 1874, King Lunalilo, the last Hawaiian king to claim a blood relationship with the Kamehameha family, died without leaving an heir. Two members of the royal family claimed title. One was Queen Emma, the widow of Kamehameha IV. The other was Prince David Kalakaua, a high-ranking chief and honorary colonel in the Hawaiian army.
Queen Emma followed the English rule. Kalakaua aligned himself with the Americans. They were deadly enemies, Emma and Kalakaua, deadly enemies.
The Hawaiian legislature elected Prince Kalakaua king. The supporters of Queen Emma rioted and ransacked the legislature building, killing one of Kalakaua's supporters by throwing him out of a second-story window.
The powers that be brought in their forces to control the crowd. The Emmaites got trounced, and even though Kalakaua won the election and Queen Emma was set aside, those who followed her and supported her did until she died.
At the start of his reign, King Kalakaua appeared to be a good choice for America.
When Kalakaua first is elected king, his interest is to support, I think, the economic transformation of the islands. He promises to negotiate a reciprocity treaty with the United States so that Hawaii's sugar can enter American markets without tariff.
The Treaty of Reciprocity of 1876 gave Kalakaua exactly what he wanted, a measure of economic stability for Hawaii. But with the Reciprocity Treaty, the United States began to eye what it wanted in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. 4 years earlier, in 1872, the United States sent Major General John Schofield on a secret mission to study the natural harbors of Hawaii. When Schofield saw Pearl Harbor, he described it as the best natural harbor in the world, a port of great strategic value, perfectly designed for a modern navy. Schofield's assessment would reshape the future of the Hawaiian Islands. While the United States was focused on getting a permanent foothold in the Pacific, King Kalakaua had an agenda of his own: revive Hawaiian culture and renew the spirit of his people.
He could see that I might not be successful in creating a kingdom that will survive forever and ever, but I will do my best in preserving our culture.
King Kalakaua wrote a comprehensive history of ancient Hawaii. He revived traditional crafts and rituals such as the hula. In 1883, he erected the landmark statue of Kamehameha the Great, and later laid the cornerstone for a new royal residence, Iolani Palace. In 1887, the Treaty of Reciprocity came up for renewal. The U.S. Senate demanded one crucial change.
Then the United States raises this thing. They're saying, look, we're willing to extend this treaty for an indefinite period, for a much longer period, but we want Pearl Harbor.
A new clause was added to the treaty, giving the United States Navy exclusive use of Pearl Harbor. The U.S. was keenly aware that if they didn't gain control of this strategically important harbor, another nation soon would. But Kalakaua did not acquiesce to U.S. demands, angering many of the American elite living in Hawaii. The king's adversaries formed a political reform party called the Hawaiian League.
It's really a group of upstarts, probably most of them coming back from college, from their mainland education, and they're on the make. They want to move, and they're the ones that are leading this charge.
The League members included Lorne Thurston, Sanford Dole, and William Castle, all childhood acquaintances, all descendants of missionary families.
They regrouped in Honolulu around this reform party, and they began to severely criticize the king, Kalakaua. The king was corrupt. The king was inept. The king was wasting money, which was being paid in taxes by the planters.
They don't see themselves as being anti-Hawaiian. They see themselves as defending their own principle, that the native Hawaiian period of control here had gone on too long, that it was time that a system they considered better, which was their own system, replace it.
The Hawaiian League also had a particular hatred for the king's prime minister, Walter Murray Gibson. Although Gibson was an American, he did not support the Hawaiian League. They considered him a traitor to the cause.
Walter Murray Gibson is one of the great kind of underplayed characters in Hawaiian history. He is a proponent of the political party which is Hawaii for Hawaiians, which is a little unusual since he is himself, of course, a Caucasian from South Carolina. But as he explained it, I saw the Hawaiian people as my children, not as my underlings, and that I had a sensitivity to them that other foreigners did not.
His views on Hawaiian independence did not make him popular with his fellow Americans.
Here's a man who is negotiating with the king to bring Japan into the islands, as attempting to create this oceanic empire to offset the United States in its influence.
It was said that when Gibson died, his enemies went to the funeral just to look in his open casket and make sure he was dead.
Evidently the embalming fluid had turned him purplish and black, and so they're quoted as saying as they came out of the church, well, at least he's showing his true colors now. He's a black-hearted.
By 1887, the Hawaiian League was no longer simply talking about a regime change. They were planning for it. They wanted a new constitutional monarchy, giving them more political power. They wanted voting rights only for men of property, which would virtually exclude all native Hawaiians. And they backed the cession of Pearl Harbor to the United States. When they couldn't negotiate for what they wanted, they simply made it happen. On July 6, 1887, Lorne Thurston marshaled the forces of his pro-American all-white militia called the Honolulu Rifles. They marched to Iolani Palace and presented King Kalakaua with a new constitution.
Understanding that there was this military troop outside ready to actually physically take over the kingdom. After a very long afternoon, he's finally forced to sign the Constitution of 1887.
When they forced Kalakaua to sign this Constitution in 1887, and it was done by force, it was done with the threat of death, Kalakaua no longer has executive power, and the cabinet essentially approves the cession of Pearl Harbor to the United States.
King Kalakaua dubbed it the Bayonet Constitution.
After the signing of the Bayonet Constitution in 1887, Kalakaua's actual political power is destroyed. He becomes a figurehead, And sadly, you begin to see society headed toward a final collapse.
3 years later, in 1890, 54-year-old King Kalakaua, feeling the strain of office and in failing health, set out for a trip to California. He was hoping the trip would rejuvenate his spirits. As his ship was returning, his sister and heir apparent, Princess Liliuokalani, was unaware that her life was about to take a historic turn.
People are decorating the streets as they always did when a king returns. There are triumphal arches, flowers, greenery everywhere. And then the ship is seen with the signs of mourning off Diamond Head.
It was a signal to the people that their king was dead. Kalakaua had died shortly after suffering a stroke in Santa Barbara, California. The Hawaiian people were unaware of his death until his ship returned to Honolulu.
Instantly, people respond very powerfully to this, and the world is upset in a fundamental way. And so Liliuokalani hears the wailing from the town, and that's how she learns that her brother is dead.
Liliuokalani was summoned to the palace by the same people who had forced her brother to sign the Bayonet Constitution.
At that moment, as she describes it, you see the beginning of the end for Hawaii, because at that moment in the palace, she's told that she's more than welcome to become queen, but becoming queen means to do what she's told.
On January 29, 1891, 52-year-old Princess Liliuokalani became Hawaii's next and last queen. The new queen wrote, "I was compelled to take the oath to the Constitution, which led to my brother's death, a death she pledged to avenge." Now the fate of Hawaii was in the hands of Queen Liliuokalani, who would surprise everyone by standing up to the Americans who wanted her country.
Those Americans were powerful, wealthy, and had one goal: the complete takeover of these islands. Hawaii's last queen and her fight to defend this land, when Conquest of Hawaii continues.
Queen Liliuokalani was the most accomplished woman in the islands. She was a gifted musician, poet, and the composer of 165 songs, including the immortal love song Aloha Oi. She was married to John Dominus, the governor of Oahu. The couple were childless. Liliuokalani was a genteel lady in the Victorian mold and seemingly did not pose a threat to the American landowners who had formed the Hawaiian League and wanted to control Hawaii.
Their first reaction was that, well, you know, she's a woman. She'll be able to be manipulated. Her husband would guide her, so no problem. They've got a woman who will do what they want her to do. And what they did not realize was that the queen was made of much sterner stuff than her brother.
Right from the beginning of her reign, Queen Liliuokalani faced enormous problems. One was the decimation of her people. Hawaiians were now a minority in their own country, in danger of dying out.
1870 census indicates there's about 70,000 Hawaiians. And by the 1890 count, there's 40 to 44,000 Hawaiians. So it's a combination of foreign diseases, and as I think Robert Louis Stevenson observed, there's also a cultural malaise. As he said, it was like forcing a gallon of milk into a quart jar. And it just doesn't work that way. People give up the will to continue.
The Queen had another problem, the Hawaiian League, the opposition party formed by wealthy American landowners who wanted to replace the constitutional monarchy. They had modern rifles and political guns as well. Early on, John L. Stevens, the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, warned Queen Liliuokalani not to resist American control.
Increasingly, America was asking the question, if we're going to be a power in the world, What is it that we need to do? And one of the big answers that always kept coming up is we need to have control of Hawaii.
Queen Liliuokalani, however, had plans of her own, beginning with the tearing up of the bayonet constitution forced on her brother in 1887. She developed her own constitution, restoring powers to the monarchy and giving voting rights to her people. She was initially supported by most of her newly appointed ministers, but not by all. Her opponents ridiculed her in the press and even called her a revolutionary.
If the Queen is to sign this Constitution, they would see this as an act of revolution against the established Constitution of 1887. These guys were caught in a hypocritical situation because they were calling the Queen a revolutionary for doing exactly what they had made the king do.
On January 14, 1893, 2 cabinet ministers of American descent betrayed the Queen to the opposition party. Now calling itself the Committee of Safety, the committee approached U.S. Minister John Stevens and asked for his support in ousting the Queen. The Queen's cabinet, Americans and Hawaiians, who had loyally supported her at first, were now backing down. They told Liliuokalani that if she put through the new constitution, the cabinet would not sign it.
The cabinet essentially chickens out and does not support her. And this is a shock to her. And from this point, she begins to lose control of the situation.
On January 16, 1893, the Committee of Safety asked Stevens to call out U.S. troops and protect American citizens as they brought down the monarchy by force.
How did 400 people overcome 40,000? And the answer basically is that they were, in the words of the Queen, armed to the teeth.
These were the events that led to the overthrow of the monarchy on January 17, 1893. At dusk, Queen Liliuokalani yielded her throne under protest. She did so because she did not want warfare in the streets of Honolulu, and because she was sure the United States would do the right thing, just as the British had done after the seizure of Hawaii 50 years before.
There's no doubt that she looks upon the 1843 actions of the British as a precedent for what the Americans will have to do.
She yielded to the superior American military power with the belief that the government of the United States, the legitimate government, the president, the Congress, once they understood what had happened in Hawaii, would restore her to power as the legitimate sovereign.
In the meantime, Sanford Dole proclaimed himself president of a new provisional government.
Dole was never elected president. Dole was appointed president by what amounted to a coup d'etat government.
On February 1, 1893, the American flag was raised over Iolani Palace. Liliuokalani, now living at Washington Place, her home named in honor of George Washington, said, "May heaven look down on these missionaries and punish them for their deeds." At first, it seemed that this prayer might be answered.
Grover Cleveland called the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom an act of war against a small and defenseless nation.
President Cleveland sent former Congressman James Blunt to assess the situation. For 4 months, Blunt took testimony from all sides and wrote a 1,437-page report. He concluded that the overthrow was both illegal and immoral. He ordered the Hawaiian flag restored to Iolani Palace. The Dole government complied, but refused to give up power.
They pretty much say, we're Americans. We're the same people as you. If you want to restore this barbarian queen to her throne, if you want to take the rule away from we Democrats, you're going to have to use American guns to kill we Americans. Go ahead. And of course, the President of the United States can never do that.
On July 4th of 1894, the provisional government then declares itself to be a Republic of Hawaii.
Although nominally still the queen, Liliuokalani was powerless, but she still had supporters, including the sugar baron Klaus Spreckels. In 1895, 2 years after the Dole government had taken control, rebels loyal to the queen and financed by the immense Spreckels sugar fortune attempted to take back their country and restore the monarchy. Several hundred rebels with almost no military training prepared to do battle with the Republic. There were a few skirmishes around the base at Diamond Head Volcano. A soldier on each side was killed. The rebels were chased into the mountains above Honolulu, where they were arrested. Anyone loyal to the Queen was targeted for retribution by the Republic.
A big banner was put on Klaus Spreckels' Punahou mansion, and it showed a skull and crossbones. And it had gold and silver will not stop lead. And this appeared on his fence one morning, and he left Hawaii, never to return.
Queen Liliuokalani was blamed for fomenting the rebellion. The court of the Republic of Hawaii found her guilty of not stopping an act of treason. The Queen was imprisoned in a small room on the second floor of the Iolani Palace. She began to embroider a quilt with the record of her life. She also wrote a most haunting song, The Queen's Prayer. The song's lyrics offer a bittersweet farewell to her people. "Behold not with malevolence the sins of man," she wrote, "but forgive and cleanse." Only 8 days into her house arrest, Queen Liliuokalani was given an ultimatum.
She is told that if she doesn't abdicate, Hawaiians will be killed. So she actually signed a document abdicating the rule, ending the kingdom. It was a blow from which the Hawaiian people have never recovered. This ended their future. This ended any hopes of having any kind of restoration of what they felt was theirs. Devastating moment.
When you took the priest out of there, there was no hope. When you took the chief out of there, there was no hope. Now you take yourself out as the monarch. Well, you pretty much said that this is the end. So aloha.
After nearly a year, Liliuokalani was allowed to return to her home at Washington Place. She traveled to Washington, D.C. and lobbied the U.S. government for reinstatement of her monarchy. It was too late. President Cleveland, who had vigorously supported an independent Hawaii, had been succeeded by William McKinley.
McKinley would have to be considered one of Liliuokalani's arch foes in Washington. And she had to know that his becoming president was the final stroke in the American takeover of Hawaii.
When McKinley took office, American foreign policy was expansionist. And because the United States was embroiled in the Spanish-American War on the other side of the Pacific, it was essential to retain a base of military operations at Pearl Harbor. McKinley wanted Hawaii and put the annexation question before the U.S. Congress. Liliuokalani testified.
The Queen tells the Commission of Annexation, "I recognize that Hawaii serves as a strategic military place, that there may be a need for the United States to annex it. But this annexation, I assume, will be temporary, only to such time as the war ends." The Commission reports that the Queen seems to be very misguided because obviously they see it as what they proclaimed it to be, on a banner which will be placed on the palace westward the course of empire.
In the summer of 1898, a Hawaiian cabinet minister informed Liliuokalani of Congress's decision. They had voted to annex Hawaii.
And she writes, he says they're going to take Hawaii. And she says, "Alas, my beloved people, flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone, aloha, aloha, aloha." That's how she learns it's over.
Although it had been approved by the Congress of the United States, The legality of the action was something that would gnaw at the people of Hawaii for years to come. It would be another century before Hawaiians would learn the truth about their annexation.
Coming up next, the bombing of Pearl Harbor and statehood. We'll be back with the conclusion of Conquest of Hawaii.
On August 12, 1898, the Hawaiian flag was lowered over Iolani Palace for the last time. A 21-gun salute was fired from the USS Philadelphia in honor of the newly annexed territory. President of the Hawaiian Republic, Sanford Dole, presided over the ceremony. Former Queen Liliuokalani did not attend. She spent the rest of her life as an American citizen of the U.S. territory of Hawaii, known by her married name, Mrs. Lydia Dominus. The Hawaiian people had lost their land, their monarchy, and now their independence. Despite the fact that the joint resolution by the U.S. Congress to annex Hawaii was in effect, there were many loyal to the former queen who questioned the legality of the action.
The joint resolution was a domestic act, not an international treaty. And the argument then being that all of these events that have happened since that time have no legitimacy in terms of international law.
Congress decided on their own, without the agreement of the people of Hawaii, to annex it. And they did. It's no different than if you live in a little neighborhood and you decide you want your neighbor's property and you get everybody else in the neighborhood to agree that you should have their property, and they sign a piece of paper and you take it to your neighbor and say, okay, we all decided I now have your property. That's basically what the United States did to Hawaii in 1898.
But without effective arms or political clout, any struggle against the Republic or the United States by Hawaiians would have been futile. And when Liliuokalani died in 1917 at age 79, the desire to fight for the return of the Hawaiian nation seemed to die with her.
I think she understood that things were changing and probably weren't going to change back.
By the time Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, any opposition to the U.S. control of Hawaii had long been forgotten. After World War II, politicians began to lobby for statehood with the promise that Hawaiians would be granted the same civil and legal rights of all American citizens. These were compelling reasons for people in Hawaii to take a vote to become a permanent part of the United States. In 1959, the vote for statehood passed by an overwhelming majority.
Everybody who was a Hawaii resident at the time got to vote, including transients, including military, not just Hawaiians. And I'm not convinced that we asked the question to the right people.
Any hope of anything being undone from the century before had long dissipated by the time I was born. My parents were raised to understand the absolute inevitability of what was here. And so, given no alternative, statehood seemed great.
34 years later, in 1993, the U.S. Congress passed the Apology Resolution, expressing regret for the overthrow of the kingdom in 1893 and for the deprivation of rights of Native Hawaiians to self-determination. 5 years after the apology, there was a more important revelation for Native Hawaiians who would see that there had been people, their ancestors, who had not simply given up and given in, and that long-forgotten claims that annexation had been illegal might be legitimate. In 1998, on the 100th anniversary of the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands, a researcher combing the National Archives came across petitions from 1897 signed by thousands of Native Hawaiians protesting the overthrow of the Queen and the proposed annexation. These documents were signed by virtually every Hawaiian living in the islands at the time.
When those petitions were placed in public view, right, thousands of people came to see them, to see their family name, and to know that their ancestors had not rolled over, as everyone had been told.
With this revelation, a renewed sense of self-determination and cultural pride welled up within the Hawaiians living throughout the islands. And although the return of the Hawaiian nation to its people may be a legal battle that cannot be won, there is a resurgence in Hawaiian language, traditions, and cultural identity that is returning the heart of a nation to its people. Perhaps the prophecy of the past, that Hawaii will be devoured by great ships, will not be its final fate.
When Hawaii joined the Union, the state legislature designated it the Aloha State. That term is often used as a greeting, but to Hawaiians it carries a deeper meaning. Aloha has been described as something that resides deep within the Hawaiian soul. Anyone possessing aloha gives love, even when that love is not returned. Perhaps it's that spirit of aloha that enabled the people of these islands, my people, to endure so much without losing hope. I'm Kelly Hu. Thanks for joining us.
The brain is the most complicated device we've found in the universe. What is intelligence, consciousness? Why do brains sleep and dream?
We will get to a point when there will be instantaneous communication from the web to our brains.
The Brain, tomorrow at 10 on HI.